All right, so I think we will get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So my name is Gina Catanazzo, and I am the Educational Technology Committee, ETC for short, representative for Seneca College. The virtual Lunch and Learn webinars are brought to you by the ETC Committee. The ETC is comprised of members from all 24 colleges in Ontario. The sharing of ideas, best practices, and teaching and learning strategies related to the use of technologies inside and outside of the classroom is a central characteristic of the committee and the inspiration for this webinar series. This session today will be recorded for future viewing, and you can access that once it is on our website at our website address, which I will post in the chat right now. We do have another upcoming webinar in this series, and that webinar is Foundations of Accessibility for Digital Materials on November 24th at 11 a.m. Want to facilitate a webinar? We are now accepting volunteers for the winter 2022 term. To submit your proposal, visit our website at the link shown, and I'm also going to post it in the chat right now. All right, and without further ado, I would like to introduce Louisa Lambret. Is it Lambret or Lambretts with the S?
It's Lambretts, yes.
Lambretts,
Yes.
from Algonquin College, facilitating our webinar today called PowerPoint Makeover, Applying Content Design Principles to Your Learning Content. And now I will stop sharing, Louisa, and it's over to you.
Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone. Good morning, happy Tuesday. I'm going to just get my screen set up here. Just give me a moment to make some adjustments. But as Gina mentioned, I work for Learning and Teaching Services at Algonquin College. And I'm a veteran of the college by now. I've been there for about 18 years. I can't believe it. But during that time, I've worked mostly for Learning and Teaching Services in a variety of capacities. Did a long stint providing educational technology support. Also have taught part-time over the years. And over the past 4 years or so, I've been working as a teaching and learning design strategist. So I get to have a lot of fun supporting faculty with the teaching projects and initiatives that are underway at Algonquin College. So I'm very happy to be here with all of you this morning. And I see my colleague Sarah is in attendance today, so good morning. And thanks for being here. Probably more for moral support, I imagine, because I know you're well versed in this stuff. But today we're going to talk about PowerPoint and specifically content design focused on using PowerPoint for learning. So today, the way things are going to be organized is that we're going to do a little bit of theory, but mostly we're going to do some exploration and actually get in there and try to do some slide makeovers, or at the very least, look at some examples of some bad slide design and have some breakout discussions about how perhaps those slides could be improved. So I'll show you a breakdown of what we're going to do. So really, if you want to think of today's session as maybe just some light renovation, I know it's at the end of the semester and it is a good time to think about how perhaps you could spruce up your PowerPoints that you use for teaching. I really fully appreciate the challenge of being a busy prof. You probably don't have the mental space, let alone the time in your schedule to redo all of your slide decks and even all of your different slides in a presentation. But I wanted to advocate for making incremental changes as you go. So when you have the opportunity, make gradual adjustments to some of your slides, especially where you may get the most benefit for your students. So for instance, if there's some key messages that you're trying to get across, or there's some core concepts that your students are struggling with, then it's those areas that maybe it's worth spending a bit of time doing some sprucing up on and some redesign work. So this is the outline for today. So we're going to talk a little bit about theory and just some very high level principles and elements related to how we process information. We'll review a few key design principles, and then we'll get into our makeover activity. Finally, I'll end things off by reviewing how you can design for presentations versus handouts. And I want to make a main point in my session today that when you're designing to present, your presentation should be different from what you're giving students as handouts. And the reason for that is you want to make sure that what you're presenting while you present should be designed to not overwhelm. And I'll get into more of that a bit later in the presentation and session. So first and foremost, I think it's always a good idea to just pause and reflect and remember what it exactly is that you're doing when you're presenting from PowerPoint and when you're doing lessons for your students. So I think we would all agree that you're not simply providing information. You're not just presenting discrete facts or pieces of information. Your job is really helping students make connections with new information that they're receiving. You're helping them connect this new information with what they already know. And your visual presentation, the visuals that support your presentation, are a very, very important part of this process. So given that your role is to make connections, it does help to understand a few key things about how people learn and process information. So I've done previous presentations as part of this ETC webinar series, and maybe some of you have attended those sessions. So I'm just going to highlight some of those things that I've discussed before in quite a bit of detail. I'm just going to stick to just a few very high level kind of principles or features that are related to how our brain processes information. So to get us thinking, let's consider our brain. And I think we know what this feels like, what it feels like when we get to the point where there's too many tabs open, there's too many things hitting us, and we get to perhaps a point of brain freeze that we just can't really take in anything anymore, and we're just not really making solid connections. We're not having those aha moments anymore because we're just in a brain freeze. So I wanted to put the question out to you. So, and you can answer in the chat, why do you think our brain gets to this point of freezing up? What is it that you think is happening when we get to a point of just being overloaded with information? So just pop your general ideas into the chat. So when you hit those moments of information overload where your brain just has too many tabs open, what do you think is happening? What do you think is going on within your brain? Okay, great. All right, so we've got overstimulation, too much sensory input. Yes, that's a very, very important thing that happens. And that's why an important job of our presenting is that we have to help students manage that stimulation and help them understand what information is important and what information is not relevant. And we have to help sequence, that presentation of stimuli. So information intake is faster and greater than information processing. Yes, that's a very good point, Emily. So just the timing and the speed at which information is presented. Sometimes it's just too fast for people to absorb. The brain can't organize or compartmentalize. That's very good. And I like that sense of compartmentalized, because the brain has to work on what it's receiving. It's not just kind of absorbing it. It's having to kind of work on what's being received so that it knows how to organize it and where to put it in the brain's kind of filing system. Becomes impossible cognitively to process everything. That's right. When so much is coming at you, you have to make decisions. You make decisions first off by deciding what you're going to pay attention to. That's kind of the first level of decisions. What's capturing your attention. Secondly, you're going to be making decisions about what makes sense to you. And if everything is kind of flowing over you because none of it is making sense, you can't kind of connect to anything, then it kind of just washes over you and nothing really sticks and goes to long-term memory. Yeah, so confusion, difficulty making decisions. Absolutely, Norma. Yeah, and Sarah, you make the point of can't take information to long-term memory. So yeah, if you're not making those connections with what you already know, then newer information just kind of disappears into the ether. It's presented, but you're not really absorbing it and connecting it to what you already know. Yeah, no, it's a lot of great comments. I'm just quickly reading through. You're getting part way there on all things, but never all the way there. And that's the thing. That's another thing, right? So you might be picking up pieces of knowledge, but then the pieces are so discrete and there's missing pieces that perhaps the whole kind of big picture has too many gaps in it, and it doesn't lead to having a firm understanding of the entire picture. And frustration, absolutely. It creates that sense of emotional frustration and anxiety. And of course, that just feeds the cycle, right? That's another kind of form of stimuli that is drawing your attention away from the presentations that's happening, and that further hinders your ability to process information. So it's this really wicked kind of loop that can happen once frustration and anxiety takes hold. And yeah, so Rosalie's final point here, that there's too many choices. And I like that concept of choice, because yes, when you are listening to a presentation as a student, then in a sense you are making choices based on what you're choosing to attend to. And that is such a critical kind of piece. You know, if you're overwhelmed, then maybe in the moment you choose to kind of look away and take a mental break. But during that mental break, you're missing information. So all of that kind of feeds into what happens when you are kind of overwhelmed by information. So thank you for that. That's really, really great observations. So then in terms of features of the brain that contributes to all of these things that you have mentioned, I would say there's three main aspects of how we process information, or three features. So the first feature relates to the idea of having dual channels. So the way we process information actually involves mostly two channels of processing. So you process visuals and you process words. And the processing of images and words actually happens in two different channels, and that's why it's called dual channel processing. Now, the benefit of this dual channel processing is that there's really great potential for information to be kind of double processed. So it can be well absorbed into longer term memory because it's hitting your brain both visually and verbally. So it has a lot of potential, and especially for designing PowerPoints. So logically, then, if you're using images and verbal information, then the combination can be reinforcing and very powerful. However, the caveat is that this has to be done with care. There's a balance to be struck, because if you've got too much text, for instance, and then an image, and you're presenting that to your students, then that could create that information overload. Because your brain processes information using two different channels, then if you're forcing your learners to have to switch from channel to channel back and forth, then you're creating a lot of mental kind of effort. And also, you're making it difficult for students to know kind of what they should be doing. Should they be, really analyzing the image that you're showing? Should they be listening to what you're saying, or should they be reading the text that you're presenting on screen? So a good rule of thumb, whenever possible, is to use a powerful image that really communicates the key message that you're trying to get across, and then to use the least amount of text as possible. So you would ideally want to have like a picture and then a few words, not long sentences of text, but a few words that allows the learner to quickly kind of process that verbal information. What's interesting about verbal information, so of course verbal means, on one hand, the text that you're putting on your slide, so the visual text. But the other side of it is that even if there's text on a screen, in a way that's actually audio information, or at least I know that to be the case for myself. So if I see someone presenting and they have a slide and it's got sentences of text on the slide, then I'm reading that to myself. And when I do so, there's kind of an audio track going on in my head. So the reading is kind of happening in an audio way in my mind when I'm seeing the text on screen. And that can create a conflict. And I don't know if you've ever noticed that if you have been in a presentation and a presenter has like a lot of verbatim narrative text, and they're actually reading that text out loud, that it actually can be very, very difficult to hear and absorb what they're trying to say. And I think that's because you're having to switch between two channels. On the one hand, you're trying to visually read and decode what is written on the slide, while you're also trying to hear it. So you're flipping between channels, trying to hear what's being said, and then trying to read it. And both are fairly intensive activities. So ideally, what you want to do is, like I said before, you want to reduce the amount of text information that you have with an image, so that the I guess cognitive load or the cognitive effort that's required is as minimal as possible. It's also good to know that images do process faster than words do. So our brains can actually process an image much more quickly than text, which makes sense in some regards, because when you're reading text, there's just more involved to having to kind of decode and make sense of what's there. So in summary, when it comes to dual channels, you just need to remember that your students are processing what you have on screen, both visually and auditorially, and even auditorially if they're just reading the words. So it's a good idea not to have too much narrative text where you're actually kind of reading and repeating what's on the text. It's best to have fewer words, give learners the chance to kind of read and absorb that text, and also process the visual image. Another thing you may consider is to use different kinds of graphical organizers. So instead of describing everything verbally, that you can consider chunking it out by using different kinds of graphic organizers. So of course in PowerPoint, you do have, you've got like not the clip art, but it's the little, I guess, different kinds of charts, different kinds of diagrams that you can create. There's the different kinds of text boxes that you can create. So if you're able to show relationships with the concepts, then that will be easier for your learners to absorb than just having it all written verbatim. And trust me, I know the temptation, that's behind, kind of typing everything out. I think, truthfully, especially when we're first preparing a presentation, I think our goal is to kind of dump everything that we want to convey in terms of content out on that PowerPoint. And so we can write it all out, we put it into words, and we might add a few pictures. And then we don't necessarily have time to go back and fix it and maybe make it a little bit less intimidating. But it is much better to, rather than have all of that text right on your presentation slide, to actually move that kind of speaker notes information, move that away from your slide itself and put that into your notes section. Then what you can do is when you're in class, you're just having those powerful kind of images with sparse words that are supporting words and nothing more. And then if you want to follow up with your students by having them take away some more detailed notes, then you can create a notes page. And I'll show you how to do that at the end. So basically the notes page will include the more detailed information in the notes section. So then it's a kind of nice follow-up to the visual presentation that you provided as a lesson in class. So I'm seeing that Patrick has made a comment in the chat. So there's a temptation to create a presentation that's a standalone document for a course material. Exactly, that's very well put, Patrick. And what I'm hoping to instill today is that perhaps you can still have that one document, but you try to keep the kind of detailed lesson information in the notes section. And then you present your visuals as a presentation as, you know, that's really the point of using PowerPoint, really not as a, you know, kind of textbook or a tutorial, but as something to present with and to have visuals to support what you're presenting. And then as a second document, you can print a second version of your presentation as a set of notes or handouts. So Emily, you're mentioning at the same time, I don't want to make myself redundant. Yeah, I suppose there's a, you know, risk of being somewhat redundant, but redundancy isn't always a bad thing because learning requires repetition. It requires reinforcement of those key concepts. So the way I look at it is, you know, students kind of participate and experience your presentation in class. Then they can refer back to the notes and they can review, you know, your more detailed notes and kind of make highlights or, you know, do whatever extra processing that they need to after class. So that's area you're saying, definitely I keep in mind the purpose of the tool I'm using. PowerPoint's not for teaching inherently, but as a speaking tool aid for the teacher. Yes, that's perfectly said. That's exactly the intention behind PowerPoint. Okay, so let's take a look at an example, an illustration. And this might look familiar if you've attended some of my other sessions. I like to pull out good old John Piaget. I studied psychology, and I'm also a big fan of his theory of constructivism. So here we are. So this slide's talking about the theory of constructivism. So I think this is a pretty typical slide. We've got a title, we have an image, and then there's some bullet text, and quite often it's in sentence format. So let's say I'm presenting this slide to you as my students. So, okay, students, so we're going to talk about the theory of constructivism. So the theory assumes that learning is an active process of construction rather than a passive assimilation of information or rote memorization. Jean Piaget is credited for founding constructivism. He has had a large influence on American schools and schools around the world. So that's a lot of information coming at you, isn't it? And I'm guessing, because I read it, you're trying to listen to what I'm saying and then maybe trying to kind of follow and match what I'm saying to, you know, the text on the screen. So it's all getting a little bit overwhelming and confusing. So what can we do to better design this slide? And I'm just taking note of Emily's comment. So you had to actually look away from the slide so I can listen. I do that all the time. I notice that a lot. If I'm watching tutorials on YouTube, for instance, I find that I have to look away and listen. I can't look at the text information because I just get very confused. So I think that's a perfect illustration of the dual processing channels at work. So basically, the point that I'd like to make is that there are things that we can do, there's decisions that we can make in order to make the core message of the slide a little bit more impactful. So we're going to unpack some techniques for that just in a few moments. But let me get into the second feature of our information processing, and that is limited capacity. So we've already highlighted the fact that our brains have a very limited working memory. We can only absorb so much information in the moment. So it's very much like a funnel. So your attention can only focus on a very short amount of information at one time. And that's why we're always told about the importance of chunking. So chunking information out rather than having one big block of text information. Another consequence or consideration is that because we have that limited kind of working memory capacity, that what gets through has to be really salient. It has to really stand out, and it has to be personally meaningful for the person. If it's not meaningful in the moment, if it doesn't grab their attention, then it doesn't pass into long-term memory. So that's our limited capacity sort of aspect of our brain processing. So the third factor is active processing. So I think we appreciate as teachers that we're just not passive sponges that just sits there and just soaks up, and absorbs information. We have to actively listen and make sense of what we're learning. So when we're in a presentation, we're having to actively process what's hitting us. And the way we process, the way we make sense of what's being presented is we try to look for patterns. We try to look for things that are familiar, and we try to make those connections with, what's new and with what we already know. So we're trying to make new information a bit more familiar and relevant. So those are the three features of brain processing. So essentially dual channel processing of information. So we process information verbally and visually. We have a limited capacity, so there's only a small amount of information that we can absorb at any one time. And lastly, active processing, that we're actively working on making sense of information and making sure that it connects to what we know in order for it to kind of move into our long-term memory. So there's a theory that maybe many of you have already heard about, and I have spoken about this theory before, and that's the theory of cognitive load. And as someone that is designing PowerPoint lessons, your job is to reduce the cognitive load on your students. So basically to reduce the effort that it takes for students to process information. I think a big part of what you do as teachers is you're really helping students to manage the cognitive load of the learning process. So how can we do that? What are some ways that we can help learners reduce that cognitive load based on how we design our PowerPoint presentations? So one obvious thing that comes to bear is to use visuals and verbal or text information, so not to rely exclusively on text information. And of course, we have to make sure that we're balancing the visual and the verbal so that we don't have, let's say, all visual and no verbal, or on the flip side, having maybe a little bit of visual, but a lot of kind of verbatim text sentences. So we have to be able to find that balance. But I think the balance involves being very, very ruthless about really cutting down the amount of words that you're putting on your slides. So keep in the back of your mind, there's a lot of explanation text that you can leave off of your slide, and you can put that in your slide notes. You don't have to have everything verbatim on the slides itself. Rather, be judicious and really pick out the key phrases and the key words that you want to include, because you only really want learners to kind of look at the words and be kind of prompted by the words, rather than have them, review long sentences of text. Because again, you're trying to not create a conflict between your visual kind of channels and your verbal channels of processing. So that axiom of, being minimalist and less is more, is such a core concept when it comes to presentation design. So then, Doug, you're mentioning that you completely agree. However, students will complain that there isn't anything on the slides to study for the exam. And again, that's where I come back to using the notes feature, so that you actually say the second version of your presentation as notes, and that the students actually study the notes and not necessarily the presentation. Now, there's different, ways you can manage that. I mean, you could choose, if you wanted, to provide the notes version, and maybe without your detailed speaker notes, but you could provide a notes version where students are kind of writing or jotting down things as you're presenting. I mean, that is an option. Other people prefer just doing the presentation so that the students can be fully kind of with you as you're presenting. And then the slide notes are just purely for review and reinforcement. But that's something that, you can consider and think about in terms of what might work best. So Lynette, you're mentioning too that for accommodation purposes that you have two versions because your students require slides with full notes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's another really important reason why to have that second set of notes. You can be more detailed and comprehensive with the descriptions around your visuals. So let's go forward and we'll look at another example. So here we've got a lot of text information hitting us, pretty complicated, a lot of statistics in here. So one element of reducing clutter is to reduce the clutter of words. So a key way of reducing the clutter of words, would be to not write in sentence form. So we're going to get to seeing an example of maybe perhaps a better idea for sharing key messages that are embedded in this particular set of bullet points. But let's, before we get into this slide, I'm going to go back to my friend Piaget. So we've seen this slide before. I've just added a little bit of additional noise. So this is where we can start making decisions about what is most important. So first off, we've got 3 bullet points of information. And so they're making some different points here. So on this one slide, where the author is trying to do 2 different things. So first of all, they're trying to talk about what the theory of constructivism is. So that's captured in this bullet. Secondly, they're talking about Jean Piaget, who he is, and that he's the founder of constructivism. Then the third point is that Piaget was very influential, and he had a large influence in schools in the United States as well as around the world. So one question here would be, what is the key point here? What is the key message that you want to portray? And then make sure that that one thought is put in its own slide. Now, for now, I'm just going to focus on this information here. Now, maybe you decide that in this presentation, this autobiographical information isn't as important, then maybe you decide to leave that out. However, if you believe that's important, then you could just simply make separate slides for each bullet point. So basically, what you could end up doing is taking out the clutter, so we can remove the clutter of some of this text. If we're only going to focus on this information, we don't need the image of Jean Piaget, we don't need the label. This image, it's decorative. Does it really serve a purpose? Does it really support this key message that you're trying to get across? Or is it just taking up space and causing distraction? I personally think that you could remove that piece. So here is one way that you could convey this key message. And again, the key message here is that constructivism is really an active process of construction rather than it being the passive assimilation of information. So this is the key point. Learning is an active process of construction. So you could reduce this to this kind of slide. And this could be one of your slides, that constructivism is about building understanding. Now, bear in mind, you might be speaking, and providing more elaboration around constructivism, but in terms of the key message, you can reduce that key message to this kind of slide where you have a powerful visual that's processed more quickly by your brain, and it's supported by a very sparse number of words in order to convey what the key aspect of constructivism is. So that's just one key sort of example. Let's go back to this example of reducing clutter. So let's say I want to focus on this statistic here. So an estimated 4.7 million tons of plastic gets into the ocean every year. So maybe that's the fact that I want to focus on. So I think we can all agree that there's just too many discrete facts. There's too much information on this one slide. There's just no way that someone can really absorb this. So what you could do is just break it out into several slides. So you have the attention grabbing graphic. So did you know? So it prompts attention, generates interest, and also has a supporting visual that communicates to the learner that you're going to be talking about plastics of some sort. Then you could turn this into a visual to depict the scale of plastic that ends up in the ocean. So this looks familiar. We're in an age of infographics. So having these graphical representations, is very, very popular these days. So that's another kind of, I guess, approach that you could take. And again, I know you can't do that for every kind of point you're making in a presentation, but if there's some core points that you want to make in a lesson, or there's a core concept you want to convey, then I think it's worth the effort in doing this bit of design work. I'm going to show you one last thing, and then we're going to get into a little bit of breakout groups. Last thing is, a lot of times you might be conveying processes or sequences of information. So this is the sort of information processing model. So this is a lot to absorb in kind of one view. So you could break this up, and don't be afraid to chunk this out across several different slides. So you could start off by introducing the whole. You can have one slide that introduces the 3 chunks of the information processing model. So you could show the sensory memory system, working memory, and then long-term memory. Then as you explain each part, you've got a separate slide for each memory system. So you start with, say, this memory system. So you're talking about sensory memory. So you have the attentions focused on this one part of your diagram, and then you can, have your expanded description. Then you add on to it. You uncover the working memory. And I'm just using, by the way, a trick. I'm just using shapes. I created a white shape to cover up what's here. And it's just like a reveal, kind of a hide and reveal approach that we're using here. And basically you sequence and lead students through the entire model by chunking it out and presenting it in a little bit more of an absorbable fashion. So that's it for, I guess, theory and sort of key aspects to how our brain process information and how maybe that can inform our presentation design. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to give you a chance to look at some PowerPoint examples and consider what are some design decisions that could be made in order to better present that information on the slide. So we have about maybe just under 20 minutes to do this. So I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share. I'm going to put that in the chat, and I'm going to put you into small groups as well. So what I'm going to do is, first off, I will put the link into the chat. So please go ahead, everyone, and you can click on that link. I'll let you know that there are examples of different kinds of badly designed slides. So what I'd like you to do is, in your groups, you can have a conversation. If you have the gumption, or if you feel kind of up to tackling this, you could try to redesign certain points or turn certain kind of information pieces within the slide. You don't have to design the whole slide, but you could, if you want, try selecting a point and designing a slide around that point. And you can do that within your group. So I'm going to break you up into some groups. Basically, one person can have the job of opening and sharing their screen. So basically opening the PowerPoint that I've shared with you and basically sharing that in your group. And then they can also be the driver. They can perhaps, take the notes or make some of the slide changes at your group's direction. Okay, so is there any questions? Does that sound clear, what I'm proposing as a group activity? Okay, so yeah, I see some thumbs up in the participation panel, so perfect. So I'm just going to break you up into your breakout rooms. Just bear with me for a moment. I'll stop sharing to do that. All right, well, welcome back. So I know that was a really rapid conversation, but before we do a very, very, very quick debrief, I wanted to mention that it's all fine and good to add images, but I know probably what's up top of mind is, well, where can I get some images that are freely available to use? So I wanted to share some of these image sources, and what I will do is on the website, we will be sharing the PowerPoint slides, or I guess in my case, to be the model, I'll share the handout notes that will include the websites for these image sources. But these are some places that I go in order to look for some images and graphics to support my presentation. So just wanted to provide that as a little bit of a takeaway for you. But let's just have a very brief discussion about the presentation designs that you've looked at. So let me bring that on the screen and we'll take a look. And here we go. Okay, so I won't do the whole sort of presentation share for this, but let's just take a look at this set of slides related to art history. So what are some ideas for making this a bit more impactful? What are some techniques that you could use in order to better present this information? You just put a few ideas in the chat. So representative visuals for each time period. Yeah, right? We're talking about art. So this would be the perfect opportunity to embed some really impactful art. So very good point. So clean, consistent text. Yes, too many different styles going on. There's too much text going on. It just creates a lot of overload. Present in blocks and tables. Yes, excellent point. So you can block out the chunks of information. Change the title to something more meaningful. Yes, absolutely. So the title is it kind of goes without saying, the whole course is about medieval art. You don't need to kind of add that to the title, so make that more meaningful. So yeah, excellent point. Use transitions to expand on each. Yes, absolutely. You could use transitions. Sarah's saying we spoke about the different themes like royalty and Christianity. Perfect opportunity for students to construct their own meaning. Yes, show them several images, have your students identify what the themes would be. So excellent point. So instead of just giving them all the information, maybe present the visuals and have them engage with identifying the themes. So then they're being active in the sense making. And they are presenting the information. You're not having to tell the information to students. So excellent points. I'll just add a couple more things. You could choose to break out these points across several slides. And I think there is this myth that you shouldn't have too many slides in your presentation. And I'm of the opinion that you're going to be designing a particular presentation on a topic for a certain period of time, let's say 40 minutes or 30 minutes. So it's best to sequence your complex concepts over several slides, because otherwise it's just too much for students to absorb in one slide, and not to be afraid of doing so. So yeah, lots of great ideas here. You could even create other activities, like Quizlets to support the activity. So yeah, excellent. So what I'm hearing here is that there's different ways of having students also kind of bring forward the information, and not just having you present and give the information to the students. So excellent. So just going to move to the water cycle. So what about this topic? What are some things that could be done here? So again, you can put in your comments. And maybe some of you didn't get to this topic, and that's quite okay if you didn't. So this is an example of content that's perhaps more of a cycle or a process. Any quick thoughts about the presentation of this information? Any ways that it could be improved? Or maybe just, to save. Yeah, so Candace, you're saying you could put in an actual cycle style insert. Yes. So you've got, like I said, there's those diagrams, these info kind of graphic diagrams that you could place. Smart art. And that's a way of actually showing the cycle. So actually showing a visual of the cycle that it goes from one step to the next to the next. So that's a great idea. So then break up the paragraph into digestible points. Yes, excellent. So there's a lot packed into that one paragraph. So you can break it out into bullet points, and well-crafted bullet points. So only using keywords and not using narrative style. So then actually using a great video can break things up. Yeah, excellent. I mean, as a cycle, you could have a dynamic kind of video that actually shows, going from one part to the next, instead of trying to capture it in just text and having it all on sort of one visual diagram. Yeah, so Justin, you mentioned use one good image instead of three. Yeah, so there's too many sort of images in this slide, and they don't really totally serve a purpose, do they? They almost seem ornamental at this point, and they don't really support the cycle. So again, you're trying to communicate the idea of the cycle, and those images don't really convey that or reinforce it. So yeah, so thank you very much for those comments. So I've got exactly about 3 minutes, and I promised that I would show you how you can create your notes. So let me demonstrate that. So I'll share the PowerPoint on my computer. I'm just going to show the whole thing here. So what you can do is right now, what you're seeing is my editing kind of view of my PowerPoint. So if I wanted to save this as a handout for my students, I would go to File, and I would go to Print. And under the Settings section, so you've got Slides, and you have a choice. So I think the default often might be full page slides. And you can see there's different options, but you could choose Notes page. And you'll see here that in selecting Notes page, that the speaker notes are saved underneath. So then what you could do is select that, and you can print. And what I do is I print it as a PDF. So now I'll click on Print, then it saves as a PDF. And I've shared this with my students, and I've checked this with a screen reader, and my screen reader is able to read the speaker notes. So that also makes that PowerPoint handout accessible. So that's a benefit of saving it as a notes handout as well. So If you save it as a PDF, then it gives the option that students can review that on screen, and they don't necessarily have to print it as papers. But certainly, if that is a consideration, so Liz, you make the point that, perhaps, printing it as paper does waste a lot of paper. So the other option is, rather than now this isn't going to save the notes feature, but you could choose to, oh, my print is not responding. Sorry about that. Computer overload. But all that to say, there is an option where you can have more than one slide on one paper, and the students can double print them as well. So that takes us to 12 o'clock on the dot. So I know we covered a lot of ground, but I hope you're able to walk away with some nuggets of information. I'll put my email in the chat. I have a slide with my email, but my PowerPoint is frozen. So let me just put my email address in the chat. So I'm Lambrell, Lambrel, at algonquincollege.com. So please feel free to send me a note. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, it was lovely spending an hour with you. And I hope you join us for more sessions to come. And we've got Gina's session that's coming up in, I think, another week or so. So maybe Gina, you can confirm that in the chat. I forget the date of it already, but there is another session coming up. But have a wonderful day, everyone. Gina, thanks for confirming. So it's in 2 weeks. So you can find that on our EdTech Ontario website under the webinar section. You can sign up there. Hey, well, thank you all. And we'll also be posting the video and the notes for the session as well on the website. Perfect. Thanks, Gina. Thanks for posting that website.